here's a breakdown for today. So the theme of today is tools for artists. So traditionally when you've used Unity, you've opened it up, you've dropped the model in, and then you've been straight into Mono, Develop, or Visual Studio, and a lot of artists have come to me and we're going, oh, I really want to show my stuff off, how do I learn how to code? I'm going to reverse that and give people more tools to show their work off and to create experiences. So for the past year, we've been adding a lot of features around that idea and getting iteration times down so you don't have to go to another team member to say, hey, can you implement this for me, and come back and then see if it's working for you. So this is the agenda for today. And so 90% of today I'll spend in Unity showing you these features. The idea is to give you a mental framework for how they work and some resources so you can go away afterwards and dig in deeper if you'd like. It's not a step-by-step tutorial by any means. And feel free to yell out and ask questions as we go along as well. So the first big chunk of time is going to be on timeline and Cinemachine, which is probably our key feature that we're showing off here. And then we'll have a break just for 10 minutes. Unfortunately, we couldn't get catering in today, I'm sorry. So we're just going to have a quick break, stretch our legs, clear our heads, get the blood oxygen flow back in. And then I'll do 2 shorter sessions, one on mixed lighting modes, and this is about how to choose lighting for your project that balances quality and performance. We've got a whole bunch, lighting's got a little more complicated, we've got a bunch more options in there that you should know about, at least when they know that they exist. And then we'll finish off with the post-processing stack and some improvements that we've made to that. So I'll show you version 2, but it'll still be applicable to version 1 as well. And then we'll finish. So let's go onto timeline. So, and this is me. So John Seatsma, I've already been introduced. So I've been primarily a programmer, for over 20 years and making games for over 10 years now, and I was also being a teacher as well, and it's nice to see a student back here for some more. So, so what is this about? So why did we create these tools? So timeline as heart is quite a simple concept. You can drag things onto a timeline and make them play it over time. That makes a lot of sense for cutscenes, but the more you think about it, the more you can actually use this feature. So some of the things that just some examples that come to mind are setting the scene. So when you come into an application or a game for the first time, often you want to have a character say something, do some animation, with the camera around to give you some context of where you're at. Those are the sort of things that timeline is good for, tying a whole bunch of different elements together over a short span of time. So I'm going to focus today more on mini interactions that mix into gameplay rather than big cutscenes. So when there's a key moment, again, you want to provide some context, you play some particles, play some audio, or even non-interaction events. So you might walk into a particular area and you might want some ambient noise to come up or some birds to fly by or something like that. Again, that's a thing you can kick off in timeline. And timelines aren't universal. So you can have as many timelines as you want. So you can have a timeline that's controlling your weather and time of day, as well as the timelines I just mentioned here for specific interactions. But really what I want to do is show you how it works. I'm going to be using these assets today. I will give you this entire project, so there'll be a link to this. So anything I show you today, you can download and play around with yourself. The assets are taken from this tutorial we have, which is an adventure game, point-and-click adventure game, so you can get the assets by themselves if you'd like to as well. So this is our demo scene. Let's have a look at what's going on. I've got this punk girl here, and I've got an orbit camera around that I'll show you how that works. And then we have in front of each, we have all these stalls in this marketplace, and in front of each we have a little interaction pad like this. So this says press E to talk. The coffee bot. Please give me my coffee. This is just like how it works. And of course I'll put it in my pocket. You're getting a programmer involved, and for the coders in the room, it's yield, return, new, wait for seconds, right? And tying all those elements together, or animation events or something like that. This is how we're tying it together now. Where people at the back, feel free to move down if you can't see. I will zoom in as much as possible to show you what's going on, but there is a lot of stuff going on in this interface, so feel free to come forward and have a look. So this is the timeline here. So we've got a number of things interacting with each other. We've got the coffee bot doing its thing. We've got the punk girl who's taken the coffee. We've got a camera there as well. We had a camera blend in. So how do we tie all these things together? Well, with this timeline, let's look at the punk first. So, let's look at the coffee bot first, which is doing most of the things here. So there's all these tracks down here, which I've sequenced. So the top track here is an animation track. So all I have is a whole bunch of animations that I've put down. and I can grab those and move them around. Let's go into the scene view, have a good look at this coffee bot here. Now this is the first key workflow improvement. I'm not in play mode here, but I can scrub through and see what's going on. So prior to this, if I wanted to test out this interaction, I'd be going to play mode, going up pressing E, oh, it's not quite right, let's go to play mode, make some tweaks. So now it's nice to be able to actually just go through and go, oh, actually, you know what? Oh, there's a big pop there in that animation, right? That's not quite right. So all I can have to do is grab this animation here, drag it a little bit, maybe extend it. And so when I drag, it blends those animations together. And so now I can go, oh yeah, that's better. Now I don't have that same pop, right? So that's the workflow improvement we've got. You can also make changes when you're in play mode as well. So I can go into play, get in a situation, make tweaks, and they stick. So you don't have to buy an asset store plugin for that anymore. So that's the first one. That's animation. That's pretty cool, just to be able to put things on. This animation overrides anything that's happening in a mechanism. So if you have a character that's doing something and walking around and idling, instead of having to make a complicated animation state machine, I can just say, hey, no, I actually just want you to play this right now. So let's have a look at some other tracks here. So one of the little, you could call it a hack, I call it a trick. One of the things we do here is when the coffee bot reaches behind its head, this coffee cup just magically appears from nowhere, right? So how does that happen? Well, that's another type of track. We have an activation track here. So this coffee cup here is disabled by default. And when it comes to this activation block here, it gets enabled. And when it leaves that activation block, it gets disabled. So that's just a cute little trick of like, hey, we can make something appear and disappear pretty easily. But it brings up also the next important concept here in timelines. Timelines actually aren't part of the scene. Timelines are actually an asset. So this coffee bot here, when we look at its components, it's got two components, the playable director. So this is the thing that plays the timeline, and we have the timeline here. And we've also got this timeline playback manager. So this timeline playback manager is the code that we've written for this demo. So this is I lied when I said there was no code. There's a little bit of code. This is the code. I'm not going to show it to you, but timeline makes no assumptions about where the punk girl is, whether you can have input. So in this instance, when the punk girl walks up and interacts with the coffee bot, I don't want that punk girl to be able to continue to walk around, for instance. So I have a little script here that disables input, puts her in the right position, pops up that prompt to say press E. So these are the little bits of code you would add around a timeline to make it useful for your game. But it greatly reduces what you have to do. So we have this playable director. It's not play on awake, which means that we have to kick that timeline off, and the only code you need to know for that is timeline.play. That's the API for it. But this timeline here, it's an asset, so it exists in the project. Why did we do that? Well, one is we're hoping people are going to create different types of tracks and different types of timelines and share them. So you better go to the asset store. Much like now when you want to do a particle effect in your game, often what people do is they buy a particle pack from the asset store and they make some tweaks rather than starting from scratch. It's going to be a similar sort of thing. You'll have timelines for UI and you'll have different effects that you want. You'll just be able to download those and pop them to your game. The other reason is so you can reuse it within your own game. So when your next scene, when I want to reuse this timeline, I can just drop into the scene. So when you drop into the scene, it becomes this playable component, plays it. But how do I now, the question is, how does it know specifically about that coffee bot? Because I've got a timeline which is something that exists in my project. I've got a coffee cup which exists in my scene. Usually those things don't relate to each other, right? So the really important concept here is binding. If I look on the interface here on the left, these are the things that this track will act upon, if you like. So this activate track, it acts upon this coffee cup that's in the scene. So that's how I tie the two things together. You can do this in the interface or you can do this in code. So if you're making things appear, you can say, I want you to act on that. The advantage of this is, so if I have an animation track that works on a humanoid, I can bind that to any humanoid in my game and make it play that timeline. So it makes it extremely reusable. In this case, I can make anything active or non-active. The next track I have down the bottom is a control track. So this one here is a little bit of a fudge, I must admit. A control track is something that can make particles appear, it can instantiate prefabs, it can also play other timelines. So it gets very Inception-like, you can nest timelines within each other. And when you're doing this, I really encourage you to do this. You start with like a basic interaction, like if you're doing a UI, you'd make a button timeline, and then you'd nest that within a bigger timeline thing so you can reuse those. And if you've got a button timeline, then I want to have instances of that around my UI, right? So that's why we want to be able to nest them. And this one in particular controls this particle system that's coming out of the coffee bot's mouth, this coffee that's coming out. And the last track here is the audio track. So I've got a whole bunch of audio tracks I've dumped on, and it is bound to an audio source. So that's where it's going to play from. This means it's going to play from where the coffee bot is. So we have the workflow improvement here of being able to scrub backwards and forwards. The other thing I really like is this is really visual. So when this coffee cup appears, I just want to play this little clip, a track that just goes click, just make a little clicking sound, and I want that to happen as soon as the cup appears. Well, I can just line them up inside timeline, and now I know that click's going to happen at just the right moment. When the particle system happens, I want to start playing this coffee stream audio, so I can scrub back and forwards. And scrubbing particle systems is loads of fun, just moving that back and forwards, it's pretty cool. And so you can see this side of the interaction here is super easy to set up. You just get some assets, you drop them on, you can visually align them, you can tweak around and play with them until it's visually what you want. So, so that's that. That's the basics, the 5-second overview of timeline and what it can do. I'll show you the sort of timelines we can work on. So this list up here on the right are all the timeline tracks I have available to me. All these ones here above the line are the ones that are built in. These are the ones you get with Unity by default. This is a fairly new feature, so it's not a big list, and this will expand as time goes on. I've already shown you most of them, like the audio track and the animation track and the activation track. There's one for video, and the control track, which is, like I said, our kind of a catch-all. Anything below the line here is a custom timeline. So this is one that's been written yourself. And later on, I'll show you a little bit how to do custom timelines. But if you want a base to start from, we have something on the asset store called default playables, and that's an asset that has all of these, or most of these. I've created some custom ones. These timelines in here. So these are just an example of you can go to the asset store, download some more playables, as they're called. They're the things we drop on a timeline. So some examples here are a nav mesh track. So I'm going to show you a lot of visual examples today. It doesn't have to be visual. You can sequence anything. So why might you use a nav mesh in a timeline? Well, you might have patrol points for a guard, right? And pop them onto your timeline, and then you can stretch out how you would like your guard to patrol over time. Those sorts of things. So it can be really anything that you've used. Fading your screen can be something you pop on there. Switching text, changing the time scale in a game, changing light colors. They're all things you can pop on. So like I said, it's kind of, first thing you think of is cutscenes, but the more you think about it, the more you think, how often do I have different elements that work together that I want to just happen over a short period of time? And there's quite a lot. Oh yeah, and the wind zone track is one I made because someone challenged me in the last session I did to what else can you do, and I created this on the spot. So they're pretty easy to create. But let's get back to Cinemachine for a little while. So a lot of the time when you see us talk about timeline, we talk about Cinemachine at the same time. They're actually two separate features. Cinemachine is just something you can download from the asset store, and you can use it completely outside of timeline. I want to make that clear because people often think they belong together. They just work really well together. That's why we show them a lot. There's a really natural use to do that, but you can use Cinemachine however you like. I'm just going to show you some examples today. I can't show you all of them because there's quite a lot of different cameras or whatever. I want to give you the core idea about what Cinemachine's about. The best way I've heard it is Cinemachine is IK for your cameras. If IK means something to people, it basically, at the moment, if you're doing camera work in a game, you position your camera somewhere. It's almost like hard coding it, right? You put a camera somewhere and you hope the framing's good. And then if the level designer comes in and moves things around, you have to redo all your cameras, let alone dealing with dynamic elements when there's things moving around, or having a script to kind of control, how do I keep something in frame while something's moving around? So this is what Cinemachine's solving. So a very simple example here is this coffee bot actually has a camera on it. Let me get that back. So the Cinemachine really has two parts. It's where should my camera be and what should it be looking at? And we extend those in a whole bunch of different ways. What should I be looking at? We see we have a little interface here that goes into this a little bit. I can adjust. So this camera can follow something around. And it uses this framing guide as a guide to say how closely should I follow it. Because it's one thing to follow an object, but then if it's moving around all the time, it jitters, whatever. So you can have a dead zone, which is a bit in the middle. You can have damping around it as well, so it won't follow straight away. And this red zone is you must absolutely never ever go. If the object goes in that area, the camera should always be there before it. Let's have a look at a more complicated example of a camera. So I've got this retro VR salesman over here selling all his old VR gear that no one uses anymore. We'll do the interaction, and now we've got a dolly camera that's going to go and have a look at all these stalls here, have a look at the fruit at the end. It's kind of a bit off because I've been messing around with it, but that's the idea of the dolly cam. So let's I'll have a look at that. So I mentioned that we've separated, for a camera, we've separated the idea of where the camera should be and what it should be looking at. This is a nice example of that. The dolly is where the camera should be, right? All we do is animate the camera along this dolly track. We don't say, as you're going along the dolly track, you should be looking at this. We're just saying, hey, camera, follow this dolly track. We also have 3 targets we want the camera to look at. And so we've got 3 other cameras here. I'll give you an example here. This is the one that looks at the virtual reality tech. And so it's saying, hey, please look at that point I'm interested in, and you should be following the dolly path. So, so this is, again, the concept of separating out those 2 things. On the timeline, what we have here is our virtual cameras that look at certain things. So these will just look at those points of interest. Underneath, I have an animation track. This is the thing that actually animates the camera along the dolly path. You can put any animation you'd like into timeline, and this is actually a really useful thing. You create a little animation clip in Unity, you can drop it on, and you can edit it in place. And so this is a workflow thing as well. I can grab the keys here and move them around, and I can then scrub. I'll go into game view to show that. Then I can then scrub to see how that change works in my game. If I want to get really full control, I can double click on that, and it opens up the traditional Unity animation window. I can look at the dope sheet, or I can look at the curves and start editing keys. And these things match together. If I scrub the animation window up here, it scrubs the timeline and vice versa. So you can really get in deep and start tweaking animations. All right. I've forgotten the time I meant to be going to. 3:20. Thank you. Whoa. My computer has just completely done the blue circle here. What? Okay. We're back. I don't know what happened there. So let's have a look at another type of camera while we're here. This is one I really enjoy. It's the group camera. This is an example of maybe not a direct interaction, but an interaction that happens kind of more ambiently. So I'm going to walk over here and just have a look at the dog as I get closer. So I get closer to the dog, The dog starts barking at me, and look at the camera. The camera's keeping both of us in view even as I move around, and then the camera switches back. So to give you more an idea of what happened there, I'm going to make that camera happen all the time. What I'm doing is upping the priority so that this camera will be always on. It just overrides all other cameras. Let me show you this in more detail. I'm running around, the dog's in view, and I'm always in view. So this is a pretty handy camera to have. What's going on here? Well, these two concepts of where should the camera be and what should it be looking at. Here I'm just saying you should be looking at both of those things. Just do whatever framing you need to do, put yourself wherever you need to be so you can see both these things at once. It does that by having a target here, which just has a list of things it should be looking at. List could be arbitrary long. And so you can imagine this would be really great for an RTS game, for instance, where you've got lots of units and you want the camera to keep control of them. And then this also supports 2D and orthographic cameras, and zoom in as well. So you can say, give it rules about how the cameras should zoom in and out to look at these sort of things. But this is a handy camera to have. One thing you might have noticed is that when I was moving the punk girl around, her head would come right to the edge of the screen, which I don't quite like. I want her to not have so much freedom. So I'm going to up the radius on the bone I'm looking at there. And now when I press play, the punk won't go as close to the edge of the screen. So it's all tweakable in the same way of how I'd like to frame something and how I'd like things to look. So what if you're halfway through a game and you've already got lots of things that you've built that aren't for timeline? How do I start integrating those sorts of things? Well, one example would be a conversation system. So let's see a conversation system in action. Oh, I've still got that camera at high priority. Let me bump that down. So let's go talk to Shark Man over here. We'll press, and then we've got this UI system that's popping up some text during our game. So this might be something you've already got in your game where you interact with characters using this dialogue system. It's pretty easy to get a programmer or even have a crack at this yourself, make some custom playables. So this is what this conversation system looks like here. I've just got these blocks here. On the right, I've got an editor that lets me edit dialogue. So I could, get the punk girl or get the shark man to say something else by dragging in this extra conversation block here and just changing the text to something. How can I help you? And so once that system is placed, once that custom playable is there, I can then go, of course I could have scrubbed to show you this as well. And then you've got that extra conversation item in place. One thing that, so just to extend on this custom playables for a moment, did you have a question there? Yeah. Wrap? Yeah. In that edit box? Yes, you can. Yeah, the text edits in the UI will wrap. Yep. So there's actually a weather system in here. One of the examples is to run that weather system. It's kind of just got particle systems. It looks pretty cool, but I wanted to go a little bit further. Rich in Sydney, he actually writes Gaia. Has anyone heard of Gaia here? Gaia's been like the top selling for years asset pack on the asset store, and it's for terrain creation. And so he's been making this for years, and one thing he has is that, well, it doesn't work with other things. So someone's made a weather system that does, say, rain or weather effects, and he's got a terrain system. They should work together for time of day. So what he's done is he's created a world API. It's an open source project that lets you change the time of day and then or the weather effects, and it will feed that through to whoever's listening, whoever's interested. So all the world creation people on the asset store are starting to implement this interface. And I thought, well, that's going to be a much better weather demonstration than some particle effects. And so I contacted him, and I made some playables for it. I should note, when you download the default playables, you actually get this timeline playable wizard. which is just a wizard that helps you do a lot of the boilerplate coding for these. So there's about 4 files you need to do to create this. So there's quite a lot of code. It's not difficult code, but it's things to, say, do the editor on the right here to change the color of the track to determine how things blend together. So there's a bit of code, but it's not difficult code, so this wizard will create something for you. And if you wanted to do something like just change a light color, you won't actually have to write any code at all. This wizard will generate everything you need. So I use this wizard to change some of the world API parameters. And then Adam provided me with this awesome scene to use. Let me just make sure it's all set up correctly so I can show it the best. So I'll just show you what this looks like. So we'll press play. It's a fairly beefy project. So it'll take a few seconds to start up. So you can see the weather coming over, fog, we get a little bit of rain, the snow starts creeping down from the mountains, and then snow clears, so we just get these different effects coming through, time of day happening. So there's actually 3 or 4 different asset packs that are all working together here just through the control of that one interface. And it's all controlled through timeline, so all those weather effects happening over time was just down the bottom, was just a timeline that looks like this. So I've got tracks for the snow, rain, season, weather, things should come down. Yes?
Yeah, this was based on 360 video or?
No, that was actually a 3D scene. Yeah, so not a video at all, that's all what you see is what you get. Yeah.
Is it possible to add it in 360 video? All these?
Yes, yes. I'll give you that project afterwards we talked about, so to demonstrate that. So what I do here is I just have created, say, when what the time of day is. The game time is 22 hours at the end, and it's 7.5 at the beginning, and it blends between them. So that's just a very simple blend timeline I did. It took me a couple of hours just to make these things, and Adam spent 3 sleepless nights getting a world together for me that I could demo with. But you know, cool. Does anyone have any questions on what I've shown you so far? Yes.
Just about overheads, maybe. So I know with like the animated art, there's a bit of overhead compared to the timeline. Yeah, is it sort of something that's negligible or something?
So the time, yeah. So the question is on the performance cost of timeline, and of course the things you put in the timeline are going to cost, right? So if you put things on there, they're going to do that. But the timeline itself is very lightweight. There's an API underneath we call the Playables API. And what that does is it takes everything you put in your timeline and it generates a playable graph. We already use that within our animation system. We actually have for a couple of years, so it's a really battle-tested, efficient API. But it means we can execute that in the most efficient way. And in fact, we're looking to jobify some of those things. So some of the things you put in the timeline, we could actually make them happen in parallel or happen more efficiently than if they weren't on the timeline in the future. That's what we're aiming towards. So. Yeah, so at the moment, very minimal overhead to run a timeline. And that's why we encourage lots of small ones, sprinkle them around your scene, and start working with them. Any other questions?